classmate or colleague in St. John's, so very dear Johnite. It's always a pleasure to have a Johnite come back and talk about their experiences. And we all look forward to this very interesting lecture about the challenges of 21st century commercial economics, demography, environment, biology. Right? So, once again, a warm welcome to all of you, and Mr. Venkat, thank you for taking this time off this afternoon and joining us.
Professor Venkat Narayan belongs to 1974 batch of Johnnites. He was formerly the chief of the Diabetes Science branch at the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention and intramural scholar at the US National Institute of Health. Professor Narayan is noted for substantial multidisciplinary work in diabetes public health. With more than 430 publications, including several high-impact studies, his work exemplifies his leadership in diabetes public health. He is a member of the US National Academy of Medicine and is Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, Fellow of the Faculty of Public Health Medicine UK, Fellow of the American College of Physicians, and Fellow of the American Heart Association. His honors include American Diabetes Association's Kelly West Award for Outstanding Achievement in Epidemiology in 2015, Danish Diabetes Academy Visiting Professor Award 2015 to 2017, Government of India, Nehru Chair 2016, Nalanda Distinguished Lecture in 2015, the H.A. Mehta Golden Jubilee Oration at St. John's Medical College in 2013, and Emory University's Mentor of the Year Award in 2011. I kindly request you to welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Can you hear my mic? Have I switched it on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a great pleasure being back at St. John's, and I had lunch with Ravindran, Mohan, and Chandramouli just before the start of this lecture, and it almost felt like back in the days of medical school, and we were very quickly regressing back to where we were. And that's the beauty of coming back to one's own alma mater. It is pretty much like coming back to where you started, and you rediscover yourself, having gone through the journey of life. You go to all kinds of places, come back home, and you find you have changed, your home has not, and you find a different relationship. So it's a pleasure for me to be here today. This talk was a talk that I gave a little over 2 years ago, called the Nalanda Distinguished Lecture. It was part of a series of talks commemorating the rebirth of the ancient Nalanda University. I have since given this talk at many forums, several major universities of the world, and it's a great pleasure for me to give this talk at St. John's today. One of the core aspects of today's life is globalization. You hear the word globalization floated around everywhere, but globalization really has always been part of our humanity. We just need to look at how we arrived as human beings. Something like 70 or 80,000 years ago, the only continent that was inhabited was Africa. Our ancestors left Africa, took various routes, and the people of the South Asia arrived through two different migrations, one directly from Africa and another through the Middle East and through Central Asia. So in ancient times, South Asia represented the meeting part of both the migrations, and since then the groups have populated the world. So the point of this slide is we are always a migrant moving species. So the idea that we are stable or some place belongs to somebody is not true. People move along all the time. But what is so different today about globalization is the rate of change. It's very rapid, and the interconnectivity with wireless travel and migration. The talk that I'm giving here today can be viewed anywhere, or if there is an event in New York, you instantly hear about it here in Atlanta, here in Bangalore. And the volume and growth of information is tremendous. There was a time when the doubling of information would take a few hundred years. Today, the doubling time of information is about roughly 17 to 18 months, and it's getting faster. And what this means is that the forces of change are shifting. In the past, it used to be committees and structure, but today the greatest force of change is information, spread of information, networking, collaboration, globalization. And this brings me to the essential item of today's talk, the need to appreciate interdependence. The great opportunity to speak at the rebirth of this ancient university. The story has it that what is Nalanda started during the time of Buddha. Buddha was supposed to have visited the place around 550 BC. It started as a Buddhist monastery, and by in about 550 BC, and by the early part of the millennium, around 200 AD, it had already started becoming a university supported by public exchequer funds from the Hindu kings in that area. Taxation of 100 villages is supporting the university, and at its peak, the university boasted 10,000 students, 1,500 faculty, and over 90 different countries. And it was a glorious university lasting over 800 years until it fell in around 1193. And 1193, to place things in context, was the Bologna, which is the oldest university in Europe, was about 30 years old then. And classes in Oxford had just begun in temporary classrooms. Oxford and Cambridge had not even started. So by the time Nalanda had flourished for 800 years as a major residential global university, the rest of Europe was just about waking up. So, the fabulous, if you've not visited the ruins of Nalanda, I would urge you to do it. It's a very inspiring. This is my colleague, Dr. Shivani Patel, at Emory University, visiting Nalanda with me. Some 10 or 15 years ago, a group of people, President Abdul Kalam in India, Professor Amartya Sen, the Nobel economist, George Eo, the foreign minister of Singapore, and several others said, why don't we reawaken Nalanda University as a modern global university? And they formed an international committee, persuaded the Ministry of India, the government of India, and under the Ministry of External Affairs, funded largely by the Ministry of External Affairs, with funding from 9 Asian countries, China, Japan, Singapore, Korea, and others. They reopened the Nalanda University about 5 or 6 years ago, with 2 schools initially, School of History and School of Ecology, and the third school is School of Buddhism and Other Faiths, and the fourth school that was supposed to be started was the School of Public Health, and this is where I was invited to make this presentation. This is the site where the new Nalanda University is planned, 484 acres, about 7 kilometers from the ruins, donated by the government of Bihar. And the buildings are just about starting, but the temporary campus houses the existing 3 schools. When I was researching into what kind of a talk should I give for Nalanda, clearly I was looking back into a history that was 2,000 years old. And I was looking forward into public health for the next 30 or 40 years. And I said, this is a tremendous opportunity for me to step back, take a 2,000-year history of the journey of economics, demography, health, and biology. And I also came across a wonderful quote from Shantarakshara, who was the 8th century president of the Nalanda University. And this is what he had to say: always investigate, always argue, always reason. So around 800 AD, you had a culture in India without a prominent university where it was all about argument, investigation, and reasoning. And I think this is extremely important as we approach a global world. This paper has been published, and I requested Tony to make the PDF available to all of you that are attending the lecture today. So let's go back to economics. Economics is a very important determinant of health. So let's see how the global economics is shaped over the last 2,000 years. A classic study put together by Angus Madison reconstructed, the famous developmental economist, he reconstructed the global economy over a 2,000-year period. And what he basically found was until 1800, which is 80% of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were China and India in some order. And then you saw the rise of Western Europe, and latterly you begin to see the rise of the United States of America. And once again, as you go towards 2010, you're beginning to see the expansion of China, and you're also beginning to see the expansion of India. So clearly, these two economies, which have dominated the world economic scene for 1800 years, are once again beginning to grow. This does not mean that there's no poverty in India or China. This does not mean that the per capita income in India and China rival that of the other countries, but it just means that this is how global economy, and why is this important? I'll come to it a little later. What is also important to note is when you show data like this, immediately there's an assumption that India and China are growing at the cost of Western Europe or at the cost of the United States, and that propels nationalism. But that is not true. What is really happening is the global economy on the whole is growing, and India and China's share of that global economy is expanding, and that it should, because these are the two largest countries in the world in terms of population. So I think I'm showing you the slide essentially to dispel the myth that one group has to lose for the other to win. That's not the case in a modern economy. This is a very important slide, and I want you to pay attention to this. These are data showing you the per capita income of two regions of the world. The red line is the Indian subcontinent, and the blue line is that of the United Kingdom. And this 250-year period from 1700 to 1950 was when India was under the British influence, initially under the East India Company, and then later under the British Crown. So what you see here, adjusted for today's dollar, adjusted for inflation, the per capita income of India remained flat for 250 years. Whereas in the same period, you're seeing a 7-fold increase in per capita income of the United Kingdom. And most of the 7-fold increase actually happened between 1800 and 1950. If you go back to 1600, the per capita income of India was in fact higher than that of Britain. So the reason people, again, as medical students, an important topic in public health was population and population control. So the story that had been told was India was poor because of the large population. So I want you to examine that question, and I want you to pay attention to the little block, square block in the right-hand side. I looked at the ratios of the population of the two countries. In 1700, for every 100 people in India, there were 5 people in the United Kingdom. But in 1950, for every 100 people in the United Kingdom, in India, there were 14 people in the United Kingdom. So not only did their per capita income grow 7 or 8-fold, then Britain's population grew 3 times faster than the Indian population. So overall, their GDP grew about 23 times. And the reason this is important is because if you compare the health indices of, say, India and UK in 1700, they would have been largely closer together, to each other. But now there are major differences, and we often tend to attribute that to genes or etc. But I would argue that this 250-year gap in economic development is essential to understand, and it also places into context different presentations of disease. And I'm going to use diabetes as an example as my talk goes along to show how this might be different. Post-independence India, from 1950, India followed largely a planned economy. The economy did not grow very rapidly. The population grew a lot faster. Around the late 1980s, India started slowly liberalizing her economy, really started liberalizing her economy around the early 1990s, and then you see a dramatic increase in India's economy. And indeed, several groups have projected the future, the World Bank, the IMF, several other organizations. And in general, if all things go according to what people think are likely to go, the Indian economy will continue to expand regardless of who's in power. That's important to note. It's not somebody being in power that makes a difference. Indian economy grows up, cyclically, and will continue to grow for the next 50 or 80 years at least at a rapid rate. So by about 2050, India's share in the global economy expands and India rises as a global economic power. So this also means that the type of work people do in India shifts. I mean, for example, what you see here is a proportion of the Indian economy from agriculture is going down. That does not mean that absolute amount of money from agriculture is going down. It means agriculture as a share of India's economy goes down, as services as a share of India's economy goes up. What that means is that we shift from active living of agriculture to more sedentary service industry kind of life. Demography is the next thing that I want to touch. We Homo sapiens were not a very populated species for a very long time. In fact, for the first time we reached 1 billion people was around the early 1800s. And then it took another 127 years for the world to add another 1 billion Homo sapiens. And then we start growing exponentially, and now there are indications that at some point there will be a plateauing and even a decline. Like India's fertility rates now are about 2.2, which means that India is approaching replacement levels. China is 1.7, so China's population will shrink, and there are estimates suggesting that China's total population might shrink from 1.6 billion to even 800 or 900 million by the end of the century. And most of the other shift in the demography would be more and more older people in all the economies of the world. And this is true in across the world. And in fact, you may not realize, but there are 104 countries in the world today which are below population replacement. So these are wonderful data from Thomas McEwen, who analyzed the changes in health status and mortality in England and Wales during a 100-year period in the 19th century, where the 19th century was when industrialization was happening. And I showed you earlier that the British economy expanding rapidly. And they also saw huge declines in mortality levels during the 100-year period. And most of the decline, in fact, the majority of the decline, was because of declines in 6 major infectious diseases. And I've charted for you 4 of them. And what's important in this slide is the decline in mortality rates from these fatal infectious diseases already started happening long before scientific advances like the identification of mycobacterium tuberculosis or chemotherapy or vaccination. Other things were happening. What were there? And McEwen concluded in this classic thesis that population growth and improved health between 1770 and 1900 in the UK was due to environmental and nutritional factors. In fact, he did an assessment that about 90% of the improvement was because of better food production and better food distribution. So food was very, very important. And about 6 or 7% was because of better hygiene, and only about 3% was because of vaccination and other things. And the impact of medicine was negligible. Very important to note, particularly in the presence of medical students. So what we see today is worldwide, across all countries of the world, there are 1 or 2 exceptions, life expectancy is increasing. United States, Mexico, Brazil, India, the least developed countries, everywhere, life expectancy is increasing. And I want to make 2 important observations here. Firstly, in the United States, in a 100-year period from 1900 to 2000, we gained about 33 or 34 years of life. And we've estimated that 28 of those 34 years was because of public health. It was not because of medicine. And what is also important, in countries like China and India, which are growing rapidly now, the same gain that took the US and Western Europe 100 years is being achieved in 30 years or less. So fast forward in terms of improvement in health and disease, huge reductions in childhood mortality, huge reductions in maternal mortality, etc. This also means that the pattern of disease changes very rapidly. If you looked at 1990, the leading causes of death, a high number of them would be communicable diseases and diseases of undernutrition and diseases of poverty. But by 2010, you're beginning to see a shift. Clearly, the leading causes of death are the non-communicable diseases, ischemic heart disease, stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And I can tell you, even in rural Bangladesh, the leading cause of death is non-communicable disease today. And when you look more closely into the causes, the risk factors for global mortality, it is these 10 factors that are the leading risk factors for global mortality. High blood pressure, tobacco use, high blood glucose, physical inactivity, overweight and obesity, high cholesterol, unsafe sex, alcohol use, childhood underweight, and indoor smoke and solid fuels. And if you really pay attention to it, 7 out of those 10 factors are cardiometabolic risk factors, if you include underweight. And what is also important, the same 10 risk factors are also across high-income countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries, but the rank orders might shift. If you did the study in 20 years' time, there will be a greater convergence in terms of global risk factors for global mortality. So we are coming to a very confluent point in terms of global health indices, whereas countries like India will still have the residual burdens of undernutrition and communicable diseases. That's a specific challenge. What's also important is this slide, which was produced by the World Economic Forum. What they looked at was several factors and the likelihood and severity of those factors on global economic development. So on the x-axis is the likelihood of that particular thing happening, and on the y-axis is the potential severity on the global economic development if that particular thing happened. And I want you to look at this thing here, the slowing of the Chinese economy, the fiscal crisis, and chronic disease. So chronic disease, a non-communicable disease, is as important to global economic development or the lack of global economic development as is the fiscal crisis or China slowing down. And this is why non-communicable disease is very much on the radar screen of people like the IMF, the World Bank, and other economic bodies. So now I want to take you to my favorite disease that I've been studying for the past 25 years, and I want to show you how the historical perspective of the changes that have happened over history might actually impact the pattern of diseases. And that the pattern of disease that you see in a high-income country might be quite different from patterns of disease that you see in a low-income country or a middle-income country. Type 2 diabetes is actually an ancient disease which is meeting a 21st century lifestyle. It has been described by the Egyptians, the Romans, the Arabs, the Greeks, and the Indians. And let me share with you one quote from a 6th century Ayurvedic textbook written by Charaka Samhita. He says there are 2 forms of diabetes, or madhumeha, honey urine, one associated with emaciation, dehydration, polyuria, and lassitude, and the other with stout build, gluttony, obesity, and sleepiness. So 1400 years ago, this very sharp observer has observed 2 types of diabetes. So what is new? I think what is new is that we have more systematic ways of making this documentation, greater technology at our disposal to understand the mechanisms, maybe better diagnosis, etc. But we owe a lot to our modern understanding of diabetes to this population, the Pima Indians of Arizona. And I had the pleasure of working with this population for 4 years between 1992 to 1996 as a senior research fellow at the NIH. The Pimas are believed to be, or more than they are established to be, a pre-Columbian migration to the Americas. They are believed to have originated from Central Asia, arrived about 35,000 years ago from Central Asia into North America. Some of them went to South America, and a group of them came back into what is the area called Phoenix or Arizona now, and settled in the banks of the Gila River there. So the Native American tribes in the US live in reservations. They're governments within a government. So around the early 1960s, there was this theory that desert people were prone to rheumatoid arthritis. So the NIH initiated a survey of rheumatoid arthritis in the Pimas. And Peter Bennett, who was the person who recruited me to the study and was my first mentor, was a trained rheumatologist. As a young fellow, he observed during the course of the rheumatoid arthritis survey that 50% 50% of the population of PMAS had glycosuria. So he initiated a glucose tolerance test of the entire 8,000 people sample cohort and found in 1964 that there was a sudden explosion of type 2 diabetes actually happening in the second half of the last century. Until about 1934, there had been established reviews of the charts, etc. Even Jocelyn had been to the community and basically said there wasn't a lot of diabetes in the population. What was striking was 50% of the people in the community by age 45 had diabetes, and they were all type 2 diabetes. And it was occurring as young as children age 7. This was dramatic. And the paper was published in 1964 in Lancet, and everybody believed there was something unique about this population. So when I was spending time in the PMA study, they would often joke, what if the PMAs were just a sentinel population and we all ended up becoming like the PMAs? And indeed, what you see now is in 2014, there are 387 million people estimated with diabetes worldwide, and we are projected to add another 205 million in the next 20 years. I've been part of this estimation group for the International Diabetes Federation, and we do these revisions every 4 years, and every time we make a projection, it's an underestimate. What we have achieved in 2014 was what we had once upon a time projected for 2050. So a rapid change. The other important thing is every region of the world is affected today, including sub-Saharan Africa, where the number of people with diabetes is doubling. So it's a global situation at the moment. It's happening in every country of the world. And for a long time, people thought it was an urban disease. So we undertook a very detailed review of all the good data of prevalence of diabetes from rural parts of low and middle income countries. And showing you here is that in 1985, 1989, the prevalence was 1.8 in rural parts of low and middle income countries. By 2010, it's about 8.6%. So it's also happening in rural areas, and you see it very starkly in countries like India, particularly in the better developed states like Tamil Nadu, for example. And that brings me to Tamil Nadu, the city of Chennai, where a number of very visionary physician researchers have been documenting the prevalence of diabetes through population surveys. In 1971, 2.3% of the adults in Chennai aged 20 and over had diabetes. And in 2010, our most recent data for the CARS survey, 22.8% of the population of Chennai, adults of Chennai, have diabetes. A dramatic increase. This cannot be just ignored. In the US, these are data that represent 36 million foreign-born people in the United States. The data, the sample is representative of 36 million people. And this study was done by Oza Frank, who was one of my PhD students. And she looked at the prevalence of diabetes across the region of origin among the US immigrants. And what she found is this, that the immigrant group in the US with the highest diabetes prevalence are the immigrants from the Indian subcontinent, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, followed by immigrants from Africa. And when I say immigrants from Africa, it's new immigrants from Africa, not the people who have lived who came from Africa as slaves and have lived there for over 300 years. That's a very different population, which was exposed to a very different set of nutrition. So what is common among Indian immigrants and African immigrants today is that these two populations are originating from regions of the world which until recently had suffered considerable undernutrition, and even now considerable parts of this population suffer undernutrition. So I'm taking you to the point that this historical undernutrition might be altering our disease patterns. That's my next point. When you compare the prevalence of diabetes by levels of obesity, normal, overweight, and obese, what you see there is when you compare the Europeans, the prevalence of diabetes in obese Europeans is actually a little lower than the prevalence of diabetes in normal weight Indians and normal weight Africans. So, and indeed, when you look at the genes for type 2 diabetes today, there are about 90 or 91. Only 4 of the genes for type 2 diabetes are also genes for obesity. The rest, because what essentially is happening is most of the genes for type 2 diabetes are insulin secretion genes, whereas most of the genes for obesity are insulin resistance genes. So maybe there are two different pathways that we're dealing with here. So to summarize what we know about genetics of diabetes, because the question always comes up, currently, the known SNPs explain about 14% of all cases worldwide. The common variants of genes are similar across world populations. There isn't a great deal of difference. Adding genomic data to simple measures do not improve prediction of the risk of diabetes. This has been done through several studies. Lifestyle interventions, and several trials have shown this, almost negate the enhanced genetic risk for several major genes. And finally, like I mentioned, genes for type 2 diabetes and those for obesity do not overlap much. And that's a mystery we should remember. These are recent data from Chennai, from a population-based study of 5,000 people randomly selected from Chennai. The blue chart is Chennai. The prevalence of diabetes is in Chennai in blue, and shown alongside are populations of the United States, Hispanics, blacks, and whites. I want you to look at the BMI greater than 30, the people who are obese. Here, compared to the whites in the US, the Indians in Chennai are about 1.8 times the risk in terms of, so you could argue that there are, that the risk factors are similar, just that the Indians are at a slightly higher risk. But look at the thinnest group, BMI of less than 18.5, almost over 20% of adults aged 20 and over in Chennai, the BMI of less than 18.5 have type 2 diabetes, this survey. And we've tried to exclude type 1 diabetes as much as possible. And like in the US, among whites, that we about 1.5%. So this difference, I think, suggests that there are uncovered risk factors or uncovered etiological factors that we need to explore. And that is where the New Delhi birth cohort study becomes very important. This is the trajectory of people developing diabetes and pre-diabetes in the New Delhi birth cohort, where children were followed from birth to age 25. The red line are children who were born undernourished or stunted, and the green line are children who were born well-nourished. So what you're seeing is children who are born underweight, undernourished, stunted, their risk for diabetes and pre-diabetes is already established, and they're at a higher risk. So perhaps those thin people that I showed you in the previous slide probably are the ones that are of undernourished early childhood or undernourished mothers. So this paper had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the authors at that time offered a very important hypothesis. They said those who went on to develop diabetes became obese relative to themselves. And this has been a strong theory that's been floating around, that Indians, they may look thin, but we have visceral fat and fat in the wrong places, fat around our organs, and maybe more insulin resistant. And several of our studies have also confirmed that that's true. But I'm offering to you that there is a second complementary hypothesis that we need to pay equal attention to. And that is those who went on to develop diabetes also have poor beta cell function to start with. So you start with poor beta cell function, and as you develop obesity, your transition from normal to pre-diabetes to diabetes is very rapid. Before I conclude, I want to show you some interesting data from the Mesolithic period. This is the world 8 or 10,000 years ago. Using skeletal remains, these authors reconstructed the heights of various populations. There are 6 Western European populations, and height is a very important measure of maternal and early childhood nutrition. It's a very strong marker. As population nutrition increases, heights increase. For example, the Dutch now are the tallest people in the world today. They were not so even 50 or 60 years ago. So the average height of your Western Europeans in the Mesolithic period was about 160 centimeters for men, 150 centimeters for women. They also had 3 Eastern European populations, and at that time, the Eastern Europeans were taller, 170 centimeters for men, and about 160 centimeters for women. The They also had skeletal remains, using skeletal remains, they established the heights of two populations of the Indian subcontinent, the Gangetic Valley and the Indus Valley Indians. And what they found was something very dramatic, that at that time, the tallest people in the world were people in the Indian subcontinent, 180 centimeters tall for men, and about 165, 170 centimeters, 65 centimeters tall for women. So Barry Popkin and others have shown that when you plot the height history over time, the dark line that you see in the middle is the South Asians or the Indian subcontinent. We have been losing height for thousands of years, and very dramatically, particularly over the last 300 years, except recently. And this is probably because per capita food availability decreased. Our population, because the area was fertile, the population growth was faster than technology could keep up, but that is beginning to change now. And this is important. So this context might set a population of several generations of undernutrition to sudden increase the risk of diseases like diabetes, where its pattern and presentation might be different. And it makes sense, because when you think about it, if the evolutionarily, if there is very little food, you store it as fat, because that is necessary for reproductive survival. And if you have very little glucose in the blood, you want to preserve the glucose for your brain, so you turn down your insulin secretion. It makes kind of an evolutionary hypothesis to think about it that way. So today, you're dealing with two Indias. There's the old, idyllic rural India, and there is this wonderful, presumed modern India. But there is a third India, which is the India of urban squalor. So when you look at data across these three Indias, you might think that rural Indians are very healthy, but that's not the case, at least for non-communicable disease. In fact, the problem was people in rural areas were dying young. The healthiest, so there are considerable differences to study. And it's not urbanization that is a problem for chronic disease. I think it's unplanned urbanization that is a problem. Some of the healthiest cities in the world, healthiest populations in the world are living in cities. Copenhagen, Netherlands, New York, Singapore, etc. And in the United States, for example, a poor person in New York City has a much better life expectancy and health indices than a poor person in rural Alabama. So it's not urbanization. People keep saying it's urbanization that is the cause of. It's not urbanization. It's unplanned urbanization that I think is a problem. And as you see there, India is already 32% urban, and is only going to increase. I don't think you can stop the relentless flow of urbanization. The question is, how do you manage it? So some years ago, the CDC did an assessment of the major public health achievements of the 20th century, at least in the United States and possibly in Western Europe. And the list they came up with was immunization, motor vehicle safety, workplace safety, control of infectious diseases, declines in deaths from heart disease and stroke, safer and healthier food, healthier mothers and babies, family planning, fluoridation of drinking water, tobacco as a health problem. All of these were really public health interventions which required organization, regulation, etc. And like I said earlier, the 34 years of life expectancy gained in the US during that century, 27 or 28 came from public health. So what are the new challenges that we as a world are facing, particularly for countries like India? This is a list that I made up. You could challenge me, but this was my list. I think poverty and economic disparity is a leading problem to consider. Like in the United States, across 3,600 counties, we have an 8-fold difference in diabetes incidence. And also, the counties with greatest poverty levels seem to have very high levels of diseases like diabetes, and also gaps in life expectancy across the US counties is about 14 years. Some of the poorest of our counties have life expectancies that compare with Malawi and Africa. So I think economic disparities and poverty is an important issue to address. War and violence, very important, and especially for plural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic societies like India. I think it's important to maintain a level of peace and level of harmony. Because when you think of the polio epidemic, for example, the countries that were most difficult to eradicate were places where there were, which were, in fact, which were war-ridden, parts of Pakistan, now increasingly in certain parts of Nigeria, Afghanistan, etc. So peace and war, avoiding war and violence is going to be extremely important. You will ask me, what can doctors do? And I will answer that when we come to the question and answer sessions. Climate change, a very important challenge for the entire globe. And when you think of many of the factors that contribute to non-communicable diseases, they are very much related to climate change also. So they're not different. Living environment, like I said, we need healthy urbanization. We should be able to cross Sarjapur Road without getting hit by a car. And why can't there be a simple bridge that connects the hostel with the hospital? Those are simple things. Safe water and healthy food is going to be important. It's not a question of, we're not going to go back to days of re-cooking for 8 hours a day. How can we produce healthy foods that are convenient? How can we produce safe water for the entire planet? Very, very important. Infectious diseases epidemics, they will always continue. I mean, things like Zika, H1N, they come, and you think you've controlled some, but they come back. And Bill Fahey, who's the director of CDC, a close friend of mine, was involved with the eradication of smallpox. He wrote a great book called The House on Fire. And the final theater for eradication of smallpox is India. And I urge you to read that book called House on Fire. It's a beautiful book. And you will realize the organizational advocacy and common sense and surveillance required to overcome disease. It's not something that you are taught in medical school. Non-communicable diseases, including mental health, are very important, and healthcare systems are very important. And all of these that I showed you are all interconnected, and these challenges need understanding of complexity. They're not simple problems, they're complex problems, they're interrelated. And I also think trying to change them, we have to understand the force of interaction, the force of information. That's going to be a bigger problem, bigger way of changing them than structure and laws. And I think so. Information, interaction, global collaboration is going to be extremely important. I want to finish off with a few slides. The bottom map is a map of the world if you scale it according to land area. The big map is the map of the world if you scale it according to world population. As you clearly see, the Indian subcontinent and Africa are looking much larger. And this is a map of the world if you scale it according to number of underweight or undernourished children. And again, so Africa and the Indian subcontinent are looking large. So huge problems of undernutrition in these regions. And the next map is a map of the world if you scale it according to the number of people with diabetes. And here again, you see the Indian subcontinent loom large. So the Indian subcontinent currently has large numbers of people who are undernourished, also very large numbers of people who have diabetes, and considerable overlap between those two populations. And if you repeated this study now or in a few years' time, even Africa will expand in terms of diabetes. And now the final slide is, where is research coming from? It's actually the opposite. 98% of the burden of disease is in one part of the world, but 98% of the research is coming from another part of the world. And I would argue that I think we should listen to what Mark Twain told us, that be careful about reading a health book. You can die of reading a misprint. So you read Davidson's textbook of medicine or Harrison's textbook of medicine. Some of the solutions may not be the right solutions. I mean, your thin person with type 2 diabetes, with insulin secretion problem, you're not going to ask them to lose weight. And they may not respond well to metformin, so what do you do? So to conclude, I think gaps in per capita income between and within countries are a challenge. They need to close. I think between country per capita will start closing during the century, but within country per capita income also needs to close. This is why you need a combination of growth and investment in social issues. It's not just about GDP growth. You also need measures of social good. I think the two are important. Reading Amartya Sen's famous book, Development is Freedom, would be very important here. People worldwide are living longer. Disease patterns are changing from child and maternal deaths to chronic conditions in adults. biological adaptations to modern chronic diseases may take generations. Countries like India will need to deal with dual burdens. Most public health solutions will require interdisciplinary science. So you need hubs of people working across various disciplines. In fact, disciplines are going to matter less and less. It doesn't matter what discipline you're trained, as long as you know how to work with other disciplines. Information, network, and interaction, not planning and structure, are dominant modern day agents. So we have to invest heavily in R&D. R&D is going to be extremely important. India's demographic dividend, 50% of Indian population is aged 25 and younger, but that dividend depends on delivering health and education to all of them. Otherwise, you have a huge problem on hand. And in fact, because of the changing sex ratio in India, it's projected that there will soon be a time, next 20 years, there will be 70 million excess males in society without the rights to marry. That could be a potentially dangerous and violent situation to deal with. Modern globalization forces interconnectedness, and global collaboration really is the way forward. And people talk in terms of, I don't think you can protect your borders. The best way is to open up. You have to collaborate with Pakistan, you have to collaborate with the region. I think that's the way. If you want to prevent war, it's not by building nuclear weapons, it's about by collaboration, by people-to-people exchange. That's where the world is going, and the countries that are open in those areas are doing a lot better than the countries who are feeling threatened. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions, so if there are any questions, please.
Yep.
So one of your data, you showed where you're comparing continents and how they're doing in diabetes. South America seems to be doing much better than India, of course. So are you planning a comparison between the two populations?
I mean, I've got colleagues who are working in South America. Again, South America is a large area. There are countries, I think the big difference is if you look at the last 50 years, the Middle East and most of Latin America achieved better maternal and child nutrition than the Indian subcontinent and other parts of Asia. That's one thing to remember. That said, within South America or Latin America, there are differences. You have countries like Brazil and Argentina, which have been far ahead than countries like, say, Guatemala, etc. So there is that issue. I think in countries like Guatemala, you will find the patterns quite similar to countries like India. You're going to find a lot of thin people developing diabetes, whereas in countries like Mexico, a lot of obese people. Mexico already has the highest rates of obesity in the world. So I think it's a complex picture.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. Talking about the undernourished, the low BMI diabetes, one of the common challenges we face is by the time they are detected as being either pre-diabetes or diabetes, they are already moved on to being the normal overweight. So how do we deal with such situation where we have to adopt those screening strategies?
I don't know. I mean, for example, one of the things that's happening is type 2 diabetes occurring in young people. And I think you're seeing that a lot, in countries like India too. In fact, in certain clinics, 30 to 40% of diabetes under the age of 20 seems to be type 2 diabetes. And the other thing that people are finding is, particularly the under 30, a high proportion of new onset diabetes are maybe in what you consider normal weight or even thin people. So whether you start a screening program, that's a good question. I think this is a research question. I think that something to be evaluated. But what I've shown you from the population survey is that even in very thin people, there is a very high prevalence. So whether you should do a screening program, that's a conversation that needs to be had. But I think the bigger question is the pathophysiology different in that group? And my gut feeling is, my hypothesis is, that group is probably more insulin deficient to start with. And which means perhaps even the diagnostic test might have to be different. Like in Chennai, we studied 4,000 people. There was 22% of the people who had normal fasting and normal 2-hour glucose, but raised 30-minute glucose. And the 30-minute glucose is represents closer to first phase insulin response. And that group also had a very high risk of transition to diabetes in the next 3 years. So we might be missing these with the wrong test. And even if we found them, we need to think in terms of what's the right treatment strategy. So I think there's plenty of scope for understanding the disease etiology, the screening of these people and studying it more carefully, testing different types of treatments. And even maybe this is a group of people, if you think about it, young onset type 2 diabetes have a very worse prognosis. So maybe the thin ones developing diabetes may also have a worse prognosis. So these are questions that are unanswered, which we should spend time doing.
A question related to regulation. We have regulations related to tobacco use. We don't seem to have any public health regulations where food packaging, availability, promotion of unhealthy food goes. So, is there some model or is there some experience with that making a difference?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The ease about tobacco is tobacco clearly is not needed for the body, and there's no safe dose of tobacco, and it's a single product, and legislations were introduced like taxation, ban for advertisement, etc., and labels, etc. In the area of food, it gets a little more complex because what do you regard as healthy food and not healthy food? There's a lot of debate around it. Some of the models that are being tested, for example, in Mexico, they've introduced a tax on soda, on sweetened beverages. Some countries have flirted with the idea of taxing fat. I don't know whether it's a good idea. Several countries clearly have introduced labeling. But labeling again, that's a start. Very interesting. I was on Indigo. Where was I? Somewhere. Somebody bought the flight Indigo. The guy sitting next to me bought a pomegranate juice. So then he was talking to me, and then he said that I took the juice with me, and I looked at it. The label was tiny, and the total volume of the thing was 250 milligrams, 250 mLs. But they give you the amount of calories in 100 mils. Okay? So they make it very difficult for you to read the label, and they deceive you into thinking it's only 40 calories. So there's a lot of all this. I think we need to work on. Some countries are doing a better job than others, but it's a very tough area. Because the simple fact is, several countries, people don't want governments to interfere. And secondly, the more important thing really is deciding what is a healthy food, what is not a healthy food, and what will work, what will not work. This is a huge area for policy research. Questions?
Any more questions?
I have one here. Well, thank you for that wonderful and interesting lecture. Opened up many insights on 2,000-year history. One slide you showed was about declining growth in India. We happen to be, how to speak, the world in 1.5. Any insights to that as to why are we seeing this? To my knowledge, more anecdotal, I'm seeing this happen even in urban areas where there's good access to good nutrition. You walk into most schools, are much shorter these days.
I think since independence, I think that might be changing. Clearly, if you think of the 250-year history of colonization, one of the predictable things that happened during that time was frequency of famines. In the Great Bengal famine, for example, killed between 3 to 4 million people. So I think there clearly was undernutrition during the time. And even that is about 8-10 generations to think about. But even before that trend had been going. I think the answer is simple, is that for the size of the population, we were not producing enough food. And distributing, it's not just production, distribution too. So are you producing enough food? And again, if you go back, when I go back to my medical school days, the big emphasis then was getting calories to people. But now it's not quantity, it's quality of nutrition. It's getting them the right type of calories, less of processed foods, the right type of fat, the right amount of protein. So I think you need a comprehensive approach to this. And whether the other very sad thing about India is that there is about 30%, I don't remember the exact statistic, you guys might know better, where undernutrition is persistent in spite of the growth in the economy. When you look at India's growth of the economy and China's growth of the economy, China was able to reduce their undernutrition very effectively. In India, that has not happened. Is it a policy failure or is there something in biology? I don't know.
So follow that. Have you seen any? Is there any data to show that beta cell dysfunction, so lack of insulin, is also contributing to decreased growth?
Good question. I don't know. That's a there is a growth factor. Very good question. I think again, good something for you to look at in your data. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Venkat, for that really insightful talk. And some of the slides were really thought-provoking. Thanks for that. My specific question would be, I was really looking forward to hear from you on what should we in India as a country do to particularly tackle this huge burden of diabetes. So if I may put my question in a very specific format, if you were advising a national program on communicable diseases, what would be the priority? So as you are aware, right now we are screening in different districts, and in some places the state governments, not the national, are providing insulins free. But is that the way to go, or what would be the 1, 2, 3 priorities for the day?
This question has been asked to me, and give you what I think are the 3 priorities. I mean, I'm a believer that you should start with the low-hanging fruit first. And the low-hanging fruit is where is there very strong evidence. Okay? Like in the United States, for example, over the last 10, 15 years, we have gone aggressively to implement control of diabetes, control of glucose, control of blood pressure, control of lipids, the other things in people with diabetes. And we are demonstrating major reductions in rates of complication. So I think putting a quality assurance framework for delivering better quality of care for people with diabetes should be the first #1 priority. That's where the strongest evidence is. And I think public health should accept that. That's where the strongest evidence is. The second area where there is very strong evidence is in people who are pre-diabetic. If you introduce them to 24 weeks of lifestyle intervention, or 16 or 24 weeks of lifestyle intervention, you can slow the progression to diabetes by 30 to 60%. That would be the second, and that's where your screening comes in. So if you can screen, somehow risk stratify, and send the pre-diabetic people to some sort of lifestyle counseling, whether delivered by community health workers, delivered by your ashas, delivered by technology, and then you use the Modi Care or the national healthcare system through primary care to put in place framework to deliver and monitor high quality care for everybody, not just for individuals. That would be those are the 2 priorities. But the third important priority, and this is a very important priority, is that there is the data in terms of research into understanding certain unique phenotypes in India, and research into understanding certain of the policy level interventions. Things like what can you do in terms of taxation of foods, what can you do in terms of urbanization, etc. So creating population-based research in those areas is important. So those are the 3 things. #1, aggressively treat the people who have diabetes and put in place quality of framework. Second, screen and find people with pre-diabetes and get them high-quality lifestyle intervention in an organized fashion. Third, invest heavily.
As a diabetic, I'm tired of going to my neurologist for my migraine, an endocrinologist for my treatment, orthopedician for my frozen shoulder. Site has already gone past me. I'm just wondering, is there any evidence to show that a subspecialty or a super specialist managing my diabetes is better than a general physician? I really wonder about that because of the.
Okay, this is an excellent question. Again, this question somehow we've created. When you really examine the data, most of good, high-quality diabetes care is actually better organization of care. It's like, for example, we've just published a new study in 10 centers, 9 in India, 1 in Pakistan, where 1,200 people with diabetes were randomized. These were people treated at fairly good diabetes centers. Half the people, had care like the way they were having. The other half, we just put in place 2 simple things. We introduced a care coordinator for every 200 or 300 people, and the coordinator would motivate patients, would do the triaging, would deal with, help the physicians deal with the 70 or 80% of patients who were fairly simple to manage, and get the physician to focus with greater attention on the 20% that needed great care, great attention. And also remind us, patient reminders, etc. And the second was a decision support software connected to the electronic medical records that would give prompts. Okay, here is a patient whose blood pressure is not in control. He's only on 1 drug. He should be on 3 drugs, please. Okay, things like that. The improvement was dramatic. Okay, and also other studies in the US show that diabetes, most of the cases of diabetes, not your very complicated ones, managed by primary care physicians or managed by even nurse practitioners in a coordinated manner, produces equivalent results to those being cared for by highly trained endocrinologists. But there is a role for endocrinologists for more complex patients, and perhaps what we should be thinking of is more shared care models, where most of the people with diabetes get cared for in primary care, nurse practitioners, and then the super specialist would interact, and there would be a triad system to take the more complicated patients who require greater attention.
To that, Venkat, I've been looking at the possibility of pushing St. John's towards a chronic disease model,
Yes.
Where we don't treat diabetes as a special entity, but hypertension, diabetes, everything together. I think that's a possibility for us to work out. I'm getting a lot of resistance, but I'm just trying to create an outpatient setup which has all your elements, which is
that's an excellent idea, and in fact, the studies also show that that's a good model. But the difficulty you'll have is when you propose anything logical, you will get the highest resistance, especially from the most so-called educated people in your community, for some reason. And why that happens, I don't know, because there are vested interests involved. I mean, there is a certain interest in keeping your hypertension clinic and your diabetes clinic separate, etc. But I think this should be the model. In fact, the other thing is we are running a trial, an NIH-funded trial, integrating diabetes and depression care together, and it's working very well. So I think those are some of the things. So clearly, I think the future is integrated care delivered by lower cost providers and by technology, and handing as much of the control of care to the patients. Other questions? If not, thank you all very much. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Venkat. Thank you all for patient listening and your questions. We have a small memento from us. Thank you for coming back home and sharing. There's tea and coffee served outside. Please join us and any further interactions. Thank you.